Can you take out this PPT?
You can stop sharing the screen.
Yes,
please stop.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Professor Thorat and IIDS for this opportunity. What I'll be doing is I'll take you quickly through the overall picture of tribal development in India, and then I'll engage with some of the contemporary issues that are critical to understand the contemporary situation of tribal communities in India or tribal development in India. I usually begin, I think if it is possible, then I can also share my screen, right, Vinay?
Please.
It's possible, yes.
Okay. What I'll be doing is that I'll quickly take you all through the overall picture of tribal development in India, issues and concerns. I begin my presentation by looking at the situation of tribal communities during the pre-colonial period. And if we look at the situation of tribal communities during the pre-colonial period, then we do encounter with the fact that the tribal communities had their own self-governance, autonomy, as well as their life world. If we look at these aspects, then these aspects are also linked with their own conception of governance as well as democracy. And why I'm considering, why I'm linking these ideas with the tribal communities is these are some of the indicators where we usually understand the situation of tribal communities, or what we are considering in the contemporary period as the development of tribal communities in India. So in continuation with the situation of tribal communities during the pre-colonial period, then the tribal society was also based on communitarian as well as egalitarian democratic values. And these notions are important to understand the tribal conception of development as well as democracy that probably would have the spillover effect in the contemporary period had they not been integrated in a way that modern Indian state felt them to be integrated. Within this perspective, that tribal, like other parts of the country, then tribal areas were also not free from the clutches of the colonial forces. So the colonial forces of the British government did invade the tribal areas, and they did approach their own way of dealing with tribal communities. As a part of dealing with the tribal communities, the British government integrated the tribal communities authoritatively within the mainstream society. However, when they realized that the integration of tribal communities with the mainstream society is not leading towards their development, and they're exposed to exploitation as well as subjugation within the modern, within the mainstream society, then the British also realized to adopt a special kind of administrative arrangements for the tribal communities as well as tribal areas to govern over the period. As a result, two prominent initiatives are essential to mention here. One is the Scheduled District Act of 1874, and the other one is the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act of 1873. If we look at these two acts are were essentially developed to govern the tribal areas. For instance, if we are talking about the 1874 Scheduled District Act, then this aims to have different kind of legal arrangements in order to govern the tribal areas. Similarly, if we look at the case of 1873 Act, that is the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act, then this act essentially aimed to protect certain areas, to protect those areas from the residents of outsiders. And if we look at the case of Arunachal Pradesh in the contemporary period, which is one of the states among some other states of Northeast India to have practiced the inner line permit, then this state, Arunachal Pradesh, has got the special status under this 1873 Act, and that has protected the state of Arunachal Pradesh from residing other Indians, even the other Indians in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. And I'll certainly talk about the examples of Arunachal Pradesh when I come to my last slides about the contemporary development. So the overall aspect as far as the tribal development or tribal situation during the colonial period was that the British government had adopted its own approach First, in terms of integrating them with the mainstream society, and later when they realize that that is not helping them out, then putting them in an isolated position so that the tribal communities shall not be exposed to exploitation as well as marginalization. Within this backdrop, when India attained independence, then there are a lot of debates about what should be the place of tribal communities in the post-colonial India, especially during, especially from the period 1947 to 1950, when the Indian Constitution came into force. If we look at the debates over tribal development in India in the aftermath of independence before the Constitution came into force, then the debates were taking places along the line of isolation, assimilation, as well as integration. In other words, when we attained independence, then the things that were going around was whether India should follow the British policy of isolation or the mainstream policy of assimilation, or shall we follow the policy of integration? Because in the case of isolation, that was already been followed by the British by keeping the tribals in an isolated manner, having or with less access or intervention from outside. On the other hand, if we look at the case of assimilation, then we must also keep in mind that the whole discourse on assimilation policy were carried out at the backdrop of how to develop a composite as well as a unified nation or one nation in the post-independent period. In other words, assimilation policy was debated along the line of accelerating the process of nation building by making the tribals as a part of the Indian nation without keeping them in an isolated position the way the British colonial forces did. However, if we look at this aspect, then both the policy of isolation as well as assimilation, they were proposing two extreme kind of positions. The policy of isolation was essentially being advised by Berer Elvin at the initial stage. He was also the advisor to tribal development in India, but at a later stage, he also changed his position and pointed out that the tribals should not be reduced to medium pieces. And at the same time, Berer Elvin also considered that it is important to have a watch, but we should also keep in mind that the watch keeps right time. So guided by such kind of understanding, Berer Elvin changed his position and advised Nehru to follow the policy of integration. If we look at the policy of integration that India adopted in the post-colonial period, then the policy of integration was largely based on the 5 principles which are known as preferential of tribal development. One was tribal genus, that is the tribal communities should be allowed to develop according to their own genus, according to their own choices, and so on and so forth. Then the second principle that was part of this preferential policy of tribal development was that the rights of tribal communities over land as well as forest shall be respected. And the third one is that there should be a reasonable restrictions on the entry of outsiders in the tribal areas. And the fourth one was essentially considered about avoiding the implementation of multiple schemes in tribal areas. And the fifth one was that because in the contemporary period, what we have been doing in relation to development, whether it is for the tribal communities or otherwise, is that we are generating statistics and suggesting that so and so communities have developed so much based on statistical evidences and so on and so forth. And if we look at the preferential, the last principle, the fifth principle of tribal development, then this essentially, not in favor of having that kind of evaluation. Rather, it pointed out that the tribal development should not be evaluated on the basis of statistics or on the basis of money that we are spending on tribal communities, but that should be evaluated on the basis of quality of life that we have been providing, to the tribal communities. Within this backdrop, then I think it's better to talk about their experiences in the post-colonial period in terms of the development and so on and so forth. And I'm thankful to Dr. Khalid that he has already presented some of the statistics about the contemporary situation of tribal communities in various aspects. But what I would like to point out over here is that if we look at the position of tribal communities in terms of development then we do have number of provisions in Indian Constitution that directly or indirectly addresses the issues and concerns of tribal communities, beginning with the inclusive policy ranging to Article 244, Article 275, and so on and so forth. And these articles of Indian Constitution are essentially addressing one or the other aspects of, tribal communities. For instance, if we talk about Article 275, then that deals with about granting aid to tribal areas. Similarly, if we look at Article 244 and other aspects, then they usually, talk about the governance of the tribal areas, especially in the context of 5th schedule as well as 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. If we look at the 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution, then 5th schedule is applicable to the states which are not located in Northeast India, especially 9 Central Indian states, Central Indian state. On the contrary, if we look at Article 6 of the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, then that schedule is applicable to the state of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, as well as Tripura. The commonality between both these schedules of the Indian Constitution is to allow the tribal communities to govern themselves in their own way, as well as protect the interest of the tribal communities from any kind of exploitation, marginalization, and so on and so forth. If we look at this aspect, then 6th schedule is essentially dealing with the establishment of district autonomous councils, where the district autonomous councils are empowered to make their own laws, to have their own judicial powers, executive powers, and so on and so forth, except the financial power, because they do depend on the state government as well as central government for financial resources for the implementation and so on and so forth. On the contrary, if we look at the case of 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution, then that governs wide ranges of tribal relationship, whether it is in relation to resources, whether it is in relation to land, whether it is in relation to governance and so on and so forth. But what is important over here is that perhaps based on the lessons from 5th as well as 6th schedules of the Indian Constitution, then the Indian Parliament has also adopted a number of legislative measures to govern the tribal areas. And in this context, perhaps the two most progressive legislations that are linked with tribal areas are the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, as well as the recent one, that is the Forest Rights Act 2006. And if we look at these two legislations, then these two legislations aim to empower the tribal communities to govern in their own, govern the tribal areas in their own way, in terms of approving, disapproving the developmental projects, leasing out mining resources, and so on and so forth, to mention a few. In addition to that, another significant aspect of Indian Constitution is the preferential considerations, or what we are considering as reservation policy. And if we look at that aspect, then we have reservation in politics, government employment, as well as education. And if we look at the political spheres or reservation in politics, then in the existing political scenario, tribal communities have been experiencing incompatible relationship with the present arrangements in politics, in the way of having restricted access to express themselves in the bodies of the decision making, and so on and so forth. And I'll not go into details and in that. If there is any question, then I'll be happy to answer to them. But the only point that I would like to draw over here is that despite political reservation, the tribal political representatives have not been able to have much impact in the outcome of public policy. And at the same time, despite having their representation at the decision-making level, they have not been able to have much impact in terms of halting the developmental policies, programs that are usually displacing the tribal communities in large number. Similarly, if we look at this, table, then this table indicates the status of tribal representation in government employment. And if we look at the second and third column, that is their representation in Group A as well as Group B, central government services, they have never represented at par with the prescribed percentage, that is 7.5% of reservation of seats for them. The point that I'd like to make over here is that, as Professor Tharat had rightly pointed out while delivering the few sentences at the beginning, that perhaps one of the prominent reasons for this one is that there is a lack of interest in terms of effective implementation of reservation policies, programs, and so on and so forth. And it is not only about implementing the reservation policy, but also there's a lack of commitment to implement other additional policies and programs. For instance, the policies aim to develop capacity building, aim to increase the ability of tribal communities and and so on and so forth. So there is a disproportionate representation in terms of the tribal communities in relation to the prescribed percentage for their communities. The other area that we should look at is the educational sphere, and Dr. Khalid already pointed out in terms of different levels of education, but this table represents the overall development of tribal communities in educational spheres or the literacy rate of tribal communities. If we look at this table, then interesting inferences can be drawn in terms of gap between general as well as ST literacy rate, and at the same time, it also helps to understand the gap between the ST literacy rate as well as the literacy rate of other scheduled groups, that is scheduled caste. What is important over here is that no doubt there is a steady progress in terms of literacy rate, even among the literacy rate of the tribal communities, which is perhaps taking place more positively even than the general population. But there is a long way to go in terms of reducing the gap of gap between tribal literacy rate as well as literacy rate of other scheduled communities. This is my last slides, and I'd like to spend considerable time on the slides. Is on discussing the contemporary issues of tribal development. The first point that I'd like to point out over here is the nature of the state. And if we look at the nature of the state, then we believe that state has changed its nature over the period. Beginning with Article 46 of the Indian Constitution, where it claims to be the developmental state or welfare state. So in 1950s, if we look at the nature of the state, then it is considered to be the developmental state, largely relying on self-sufficient as well as self-reliant economy. And this kind of nature is overlapping with what we also consider as the welfare nature of the Indian state, and both developmental state as well as welfare state continued till 1990s. And in between then, we had experienced different initiatives like the Garib Hatao program, then a lot of imposition on granting license for establishment of industries and so on and so forth. However, the significant changes have taken place since 1990s, when India witnessed the enactment of new economic policy in 1991 that introduced that facilitated the process of liberalization, privatization, as well as globalization. So if we look at the nature of the state since 1990s, what I usually consider the nature as the interventionist state. Interventionist state is the state where the state intervenes in every part of social life. And I'm contextualizing it with tribal communities, but all these interventions are not necessarily justified on welfare ground or on development of the tribal communities. In other words, what is significant over here is that the state is intervening in every aspect of tribal life, sometimes for the development of the tribal communities, more often for enhancing the revenue more often to accumulate resources, to exploit resources from rich tribal region of India. So there is a change in terms of the nature of the state in the, in the contemporary period, and that does have a lot of implications over the development of tribal communities. So the overall objective of the welfare as well as developmental state, that is, in concerning the tribal communities, to develop them, to bring welfare measures for the tribal communities, have largely been compromised since 1990s because of the changing nature of the state, which has considered as interventionist state since 1990s. The other issue that is important to talk about in the context of tribal development is the development-induced displacement. If we look at the existing statistics, especially the statistics generated by the S12 Planning Commission, then though the tribal communities share little over 8% of the tribal population, if we look at their share in the total displaced population, then that is more than 40%. In other words, what is significant over here is that no doubt the state adopted the path of development to have common economy, to have self-reliant economy. But when it comes to address the communities, then some of the communities have been asked to sacrifice for the larger development of the country. And unfortunately, these communities are tribal, tribal communities. And at the same time, this does not mean to suggest that whenever state is, implementing any developmental policies or acquiring land and so on and so forth, in some cases, state is also compensating the tribal communities. But unfortunately, what is happening over here is that sometimes the state takes the initiative to compensate land for land, and sometimes cash for the land as far as the tribal communities are concerned. And this has largely implicated over the livelihood condition of the tribal communities. And if we look at this aspect, then the kind of compensation policy that the Indian state has developed in, if I'm not mistaken, in 1980s under this T.N. Singh formula, then only one family member was given a government employment when the tribal communities were displaced. So the problem here is that when there was a land, then the entire household was benefiting of that one, and that was also helping them to strengthen their identities and so on and so forth. But at the same time, when we adopted this T.N. Singh formula, then it was the male members of the tribal household who was getting the job, and that was essentially affecting the situation of tribal women also. The other issue is the issues of migration. Since the post-colonial period, the Indian state has been experiencing the flow of population from outside, and sometimes the state has taken certain kind of organized or orchestrated steps to rehabilitate them in tribal areas. And one of the guiding principles that the state adopted while rehabilitating the migrants from outside in tribal areas was that the rehabilitation of outsiders in tribal areas would essentially bring development in tribal areas. And here I'm thinking of the examples of the rehabilitation of Bengali migrants from East Pakistan in the state of, or in Dandakarni region of Odisha. And two important objectives govern the state's policy of rehabilitation. There is no policy of rehabilitation so far, but the state's initiative to rehabilitate them in Dandakarni region of Odisha. One is the quick processing the rehabilitation of migrants. The other one was to bring development in tribal areas. But that, unfortunately, that has not happened in the contemporary period. The point that I'm making over here is that whether we take the example of Odisha, whether we take the example of Arunachal Pradesh, or whether we take the example of Tripura or any parts of India, then tribal areas have become the hotbed of rehabilitating the migrants from outside, migrants from outside. As I had already pointed out, that I'll bring the example of Arunachal Pradesh. If we look at this aspect, then in 1960s, when the Chakma and Hajang refugees were, Chakma migrants entered in Indian territory, then the government of India decided to rehabilitate them in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Though they have been qualified to have the citizenship status of India, depending on different criteria now, the Adivas or the tribals of Arunachal Pradesh are resisting the move of the Indian government to grant citizenship status. And why they are moving, resisting that aspect is that the Arunachal Pradesh is protected under the 1873 Bengal regulation, which states that even the people from other Indian states cannot live in that state on a permanent basis. So in other words, so then this is not the only reason why they are resisting such kind of initiative of the Indian government. The other important aspect was that once they get the citizenship status, then they will have access to government job, then they will have access to purchase the land from the tribal communities, and that will certainly contribute to land alienation. Another interrelated issue is the land alienation, and all of us are familiar with the fact that the states which are having substantial concentration of tribal communities, they have adopted legislative measures or legislations to protect the land interest of the tribal communities. However, despite having such kind of legislative provisions, then the land continues to get alienated from tribal communities to non-tribal communities. Though Dr. Khalid has provided some statistics, let me also give some of the statistics to justify the position that land alienation is taking place in tribal areas. If we look at the situation of land question in tribal India, then there is a gradual declining in terms of number of holdings as well as area of operational holdings. If I give you the example, then in relation to number of operational holdings, then during 2005-2006, it was 56,000. That has reduced to 52,000 during 2010 and 2011, and this has further reduced to 48,000 during 2015 and 2016. Similarly, if we look at the declining of area operated by tribal communities, then during 2010-2011, it was 18.22 million hectares. That has reduced to 17.78 million hectares during 2015-2016. Similarly, if we look at the average operated area of tribal communities, then that has also declined. For instance, during 2010-2011, then the average of operated area was 1.52 hectares, and that has declined to 1.40 hectares during 2015 and 2016. The point that I'm making over here is that there is a gradual process of land holding, and these statistics usually indicate the alienation of land from tribal communities. However, it is also important to point out that if we make a comparative analysis between the analysis of land holding between different social groups, then the tribal communities continue to hold the highest amount of land, but the amount of land that they used to grasp has come down over period. The other one is that when we talk about the tribal development, then that also needs to be looked at from the identity perspective as well. If we look at tribal identity, then tribal identity cannot be understood without referring to resources. For instance, the natural resources such as land and forest. If we look at the importance of resources in tribal communities, then land and forest resources are considered as the two pillars of tribal economy. And at the same time, especially if we look at the land, then land is considered as the philosophy of tribal life. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest over here is that any move or any initiative, whether it is in terms of welfare policies, whether it is in terms of developmental policies by the state, if that affects such kind of relationship, the symbiotic relationship between tribal communities and natural resources, then the receptibility will be very less as far as tribal communities are concerned. Because when we talk about development of a particular community, it does not only depend on the kind of initiatives or the policies and programs we are making, it also depends on the reception of the targeted communities. So in this context, any attempt to destabilize, dismantle the symbiotic relationship between tribal communities and natural resources are not going to be received well by the tribal communities. In relation to that, then in the contemporary period, concerning tribal development, we are also experiencing more and more conflicts over, more and more conflicts over resources. That's why we do experience the tribal movement, tribal resistance, and so on and so forth. And these kind of conflicts are essentially happening at three levels. One is between state and community, that is tribal communities. The second one is between communities, that is tribals and non-tribals. And we do draw the examples from different parts of the country, like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Tripura, Orissa, Arunachal Pradesh, and so on and so forth, where the conflicts are going on in order to have access or in order to control over existing resources. And the third form of conflict that is taking place is between the tribal communities and multinational corporations, where the state, by entering into the memorandum of understanding, has facilitated the multinational corporation to extract or exploit resources from the, tribal areas, and that has not been well received by the tribal communities, and they have been engaging in different forms of movement, sometimes supported by the sympathizers of tribal communities, and so on and so forth. The other important developments that we are experiencing in the contemporary period is the emergence of tribal educated middle class. And tribal educated middle class is also taking the issues of development more seriously, because they are they are revolving around creating awareness among the tribal communities in relation to their rights, in relation to their rights over resources and so on and so forth. And this middle class has also formed their own organizations in the contemporary period. And one such example probably helpful here could be the formation of Tribal Intellectual Collective India, that is the pan-Indian organization that has been formed by the tribal educated middle class. And if we look at the activities of this Tribal Intellectual Collective India, then they are raising many critical issues related to tribal development, whether it is in terms of influencing the public policy makers, or whether it is in terms of pushing for a particular kind of legislations, particular kind of initiatives, and so on and so forth. And the last aspect that we should also look at the tribal development in the contemporary period is at the backdrop of crisis. And of course, that tribal India does experience different form of crisis, marginalization, subjugation, disposition, and so on and so forth. But I just would like to link this crisis with the contemporary developments that all of us are experiencing, that is the impact of COVID-19. If we look at the impact of COVID-19, then that has larger implications over the overall objective of tribal development. It began to disrupt the tribal societies in a multiple way, whether it is in terms of disrupting their livelihood, whether it is in terms of disrupting their control over resources, whether it is in terms of addressing the income of the tribal communities and so on and so forth. Just to move a little further with this relationship of this one, then the COVID-19 has put the tribal communities in different situation, as well as Indian state, to follow one or the other kind of approaches towards tribal communities. For instance, at the wake of COVID-19, at the wake of COVID-19, the government of India decided to temporarily suspend the spending of MPLAD fund in India. The suspension of MPLAD fund for 2 years, that is 2020 to 2022, these 2 years, this has been suspended. And if we look at the overall money that would have been spent on tribal areas or on the development of tribal areas, has come down to is around 585.75 crore. Because if you look at the guidelines of MPLAD, then it has been pointed out that the MPs shall spend at least 7.5% of their entitlement for the development of tribal areas, for the development of tribal communities, and they are also required to get the audited certificate on spending this amount for the development in tribal areas and so on and so forth. And another critical issues here is that at the wake of COVID-19, the government, not exactly government, the CSR fund has also got diverted. If we look at this aspect, then during this, the available data suggests that 5,324 crores have been donated to PMKs and 2,529 crore have been donated to other COVID-related activities. Why I'm pointing out this kind of diversion of fund is that if we look at the CSR provision, then at least 2% of their profit for the last 3 years shall be spent on CSR activities. And if we look at this CSR activities guidelines, then it has been pointed out that the corporate sector shall spend this money in the areas that they are operating. And in the contemporary period, even if we look at the Kaka Commission report, then they had pointed out that large number of industries or corporate sectors are located in tribal areas. So if we contextualize information from such kind of report, then the amount that I just mentioned, at least maximum of this amount should have been spent in the development of tribal communities out of CSR fund. The last point that I would also like to mention over here is the changing role of the state in the wake of COVID-19 in relation to tribal areas, which has largely have implicated over the development of tribal communities, over the rights of tribal communities. For instance, on March 30, 2020, via video conference, the Forest Advisory Committee of Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has automatically extended the mining leases of the government companies for next 20 years. That means that if we look at the role of Gram Sabha under Forest Rights Act, then there is a clear violation of the role of, violation in the provisions of Forest Rights Act, because under this Forest Rights Act, if there is any possibility of extension of any leases, then that decision can only be taken or recommended or approved by the Gram Sabha. So this means that for the next 20 years, there will be no impact assessment on the diversion of forest on the local communities, and most of these are located in tribal areas. So so we have adopted the legislation to strengthen the tribal communities, perhaps through Gram Sabha under Forest Rights Act, but at the same time, we are also taking certain counter initiatives that are certainly diluting the capacity or the power of the tribal communities. Similarly, if we look at the analysis of around 40 meetings of the expert appraisal committee and forest advisory committees that were conducted between March 20 to June 30, 2020. During the period we experienced the COVID-19. During this period, the analysis indicated that these committees approved or recommended around 120 projects. And if we look at the location of this project, at least quarter, that is around 25 or 30 projects are located in the scheduled areas of India. And at the same time, at the wake of this COVID-19, the government has also seen the tribal belt of Eastern and Central India as the pillars of development, and began the auction of 41 coal blocks on June 18, 2020. And if we look at out of 41 coal blocks, then 11 coal blocks are located in Madhya Pradesh, 9 each in Jharkhand, Orissa, as well as Chhattisgarh, and 3 in Maharashtra. And why I'm specifically mentioning these states is that 49.62% of the total tribal population are being located in this state. Similarly, if we look at last point, of course, is that if we look at the position of the government in dealing with the issues and concerns of tribal communities at the tribal communities, then around 250 crore was allocated for the development of particularly vulnerable tribal communities. However, if we look at the statistics available on the website of Ministry of Tribal Affairs, then till August 2nd, 2021, no money was sanctioned against the allocated 250 crore. So what I'm trying to suggest over here is that if we look at the experiences of tribal communities in the post-colonial period, then that indicates both positive as well as negative. However, if we compare, then it appears that the negative impacts of being integrated into the mainstream society appears to be more than the positive impact on tribal communities. So again, this backdrop, then how do we look at the contemporary situation of tribal communities in India? Can we look at the position of tribal communities in the way that Professor Virginis Khaka considered, that is the legitimization of domination, in a sense that the state has extended developmental policies and programs towards tribal communities, but at the same time, it has also established its legitimate domination over the resources existed in tribal areas? Or can we consider the position of tribal communities in the way that Alpa Shah thinks, that is that whether the state would like to keep the tribal communities under its shadow? Or can we consider the position of tribal communities the way Pratap Bhanu perhaps thinks in his book called The Burden of Democracy, that is any kind of preferential policies or positive initiatives of the state, can it be considered as burden of democracy? I think I'll stop here, and if there is any question, then I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jagannath. We will have a question and answer session now, and the first question is to you, Dr. Jagannath. And Dr. Gautam Gowli wants to know from you that what is the base of mainstreaming tribals by the government?
Okay, I think it's an interesting question about what is the base of mainstream tribals by present government. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to answer in the context of the present government, but I'll certainly share my thought in a broader perspective. If we look at this aspect, then I began my presentation when we entered into the transitional phase. Then one of the guiding principles for the Indian state to adopt towards different communities, including tribal communities, was to integrate them so that they can, they can accelerate the process of nation building. Maybe that they had the impression of bringing developing the tribal communities, but at the back of their mind, then the nation building process was the dominant idea in terms of integrating the tribal communities, tribal communities in the Indian society. But at the same time, when we talk about this mainstreaming tribals, then the concept itself seems to be problematic, because the concept of mainstreaming is contested in a sense that whose perspective is mainstream. It's in a sense that how do we want to develop a particular kind of communities, perhaps that may not be compatible with their traditional lifestyles, way of living and so on and so forth. If we look at perhaps the approaches of the present government, then the government is also taking a number of initiatives perhaps that may have both positive as well as negative impact. But let me give one example is that, in February 2020, it entered into signing memorandum of understanding with the protesters who were demanding separate state for Bodoland, in a sense that it appealed these people to leave that kind of demand and become part of the Indian nation and contribute equally to the development of the country. That's what I think I'll respond now. There is also another question that talks about that since Professor Kaka do not like to use tribal word, and he prefers to use indigenous community or Adivasi. So how can we interlink between indigenous and Adivasi? I think it's also the contested one in a sense that whether we can consider the tribal communities in India as indigenous people. I have also dealt with this issue extensively in my book, Adivasis, Migrants and State in India, about the concept whether tribal communities can be considered as indigenous people or not. But what is important over here is if you look at the position of Professor Kata, then because the concept called indigenous population is the international concept. And if we look at these kind of concepts, then they are usually developing the broader guidelines. And at the same time, what is also important to talk about is that there is no universally accepted definition of indigenous people. Even if you look at the working groups on indigenous population, then it has not defined indigenous people, but it has adopted criteria. It has adopted a working definition. Coming to the position of Professor Kaka in terms of this one, then what Professor Kaka maintains is that though this is an internationally acclaimed concept, but we can also customize in the context of India. And in that context, he talks about 3 criteria under which tribal communities of India can be considered as indigenous population. One is the place residence relationship. That is, the tribal communities are the original inhabitants of the country. But this notion has also developed different kind of connotation. For instance, if we look at the writings of Andre Bette, then he gives the example of the residents of Bengalis in West Bengal or some places of Odias in Orissa, whose residence has happened much later, much earlier than the residents of some of the tribal communities of Northeast India. So this criteria has also been contested. Another point that Professor Kaka emphasizes is their uniqueness of governance. And tribal communities, they do have their own way of governance and so on and so forth. And under that one also that can be considered. And the third point he makes over here is the sense of, incompatible experiences, that is marginalization and so on and so forth. So the point over here is that I'm also in favor of using this aspect, because any kind of new nomenclature will give them the opportunity to do different new politics in the sense that new kind of projecting new kind of group entitlement, group facilities, opportunities, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if we look at the case of Adivasis, then that is the self-referred point of the tribal communities, which had emerged in 1940s in the context of Bihar or Chotanagpur, and Jaipal Singh appears to be the first one to use the concept of Adivasi for political references with the formation of Adivasi Mahasabha. So the important point here is that the state has not recognized the tribal communities as indigenous people of India, and it has maintained different kind of positions. If we look at the ILO Convention of 107 as well as 169, ILO 107 has been signed by Indian state, but it has not signed Convention 169, in a sense that because Convention 169 talks about self-determination of tribal communities, perhaps that has not been seen good by the Indian state, and it has deferred to sign that kind of convention. There is also another question about sharing the statistical data of land alienation in Odisha as well as India, and unfortunately I don't have the exact data at this moment as far as the statistical data is concerned. But there is one paper I've written on tribal rights disposition and state in Odisha, and I have given the statistics of land alienation in tribal Odisha, but I haven't collected the data on tribal land, land alienation, tribal land, and I'll certainly look at that one. But if we look at the data of Ministry of, if I'm not mistaken, Ministry of Rural Development, then we'll certainly get the extent of land alienation in tribal India. Thank you.
One more question has come just now.
Okay.
And the question is that, as in Arunachal Pradesh, various pressure groups demanded for 6th schedule status. How so far the government leading such question?
Is in Arunachal Pradesh, various pressure groups demand for 6th schedule status. I think let me handle this question in a slightly different way. It's not only Arunachal Pradesh, it is also the state of Manipur. They are also demanding for the extension of 6th schedule. I think when we look at this question, the point that we need to understand is why they are making such kind of demands. Because under this, the provision of 6th schedule, then the tribal communities of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Tripura, they do have different kind of facilities. They can regulate their land relations. They can regulate their forest resources. They can govern themselves according to their own traditional culture and so on and so forth. Perhaps why such kind of demands are coming even from Manipur as well as Arunachal Pradesh is because of their unpleasant experiences of what is happening in the contemporary period. If we look at the case of Manipur, then Manipur does have the provision of autonomous district councils, but that the state government had cancelled or postponed that election for, I think, from 1980s to 2011. So that was the position of the state. In the context of Arunachal Pradesh, why such kind of demand would have been coming is primarily because there is a persistent effort from the government, whether it was the Congress government or otherwise. There was a persistent effort to extend the citizenship status to the Chakma as well as Hazang refugees. The Supreme Court has directed, to this to the Union government to grant citizenship status. The National Commission for Human Rights has also, advocated for the citizenship status of the Chakma as well as Hazang refugees. And recently, if I'm not mistaken, last year, I think the Supreme Court again intervened in asking the Union government to extend citizenship status to Chakma and Hazang refugees, which the state government has filed review petition in the Supreme Court. And all these things are happening because once the citizenship status is being granted to them, then they will have access to everyone. And at the moment, at least the land alienation is not that much prominent in the context of Arunachal Pradesh because there is a lot of restriction because of 1873 Regulation Act. Once this kind of status is being granted, then their land question will certainly be in peril and that will witness the process of land alienation from tribals of Arunachal Pradesh to non-tribals. So that's my position at the moment.
We can take one more question and then we
what
can.
Can government do for asset creation for tribal people? I think this question shall be looked at from the perspective of tribal communities' relationship with the development, right? I don't think tribal communities are against development. There are certain studies in Odisha also when the NALCO was displacing the tribal communities. Then as a part of their protest, tribal communities expressed that they are not against development. What they advocate is alternative development. Alternative development in a sense, that they would like to see the development that emerges from within. And that is what this tribal educated middle class is proposing in the contemporary period. Perhaps the asset creation in tribal India could be possible by taking the tribal communities into confidence before making any kind of move that may adversely affect the position, the position of the tribal communities. In the contemporary period, what is happening over here is that in the path of development, tribal areas have become the target, whether it is in terms of extracting natural resources, whether it is in terms of extracting mining resources, displacing the tribal communities, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I was part of, I'm not sure whether that statement can be justified, but I was part of one of the seminars where Ramdel Munda, mentioned that in order to have the presence of natural resources, what the state is doing is state is conducting research only in tribal areas, because tribal communities are vulnerable and they can be the easy target to relocate them or displace them from the other areas. In other words, what probably Ramdel Munda might have thought is that even if we are talking about the presence of natural resources, then let that process be equally applicable to different parts of India, not only about tribal India. In other words, what is significant over here is, that tribal communities may not be considered as against development, but what they wish is to have alternative form of development that usually emerge from within. And in the contemporary period, it's not the tribal communities who are defining what should be the path of development. It is the dominant model of the state that is dominating the discourses. That's what I can respond at this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Jagannath. So we will not take any more questions. So we will now request for Sukhdev Thorat sir to make the closing remarks.
Am I audible, Vinod? Huh?
Yes, sir. Yes, you are.
I think, friends, you will accept that both the presentation were very rich, and they brought out the two different aspects of the tribal development and the problem that the tribals are facing. And it enlightened you on their present status. So I thanks Khalid Khan, who took a lot of effort and prepared very important indicators of human development about the tribe, and also Jagannath, who has given the other aspect of it, displacement, colonial policy, issues of the indigenousness. I would not like to take your time. I would only make 2 points because they have not been attracted the attention of the participant. I can understand that the issues of identity and rights are more important, and more people are more sensitive about the rights and identity issues. But I think the issues of developments are also very important, and the participants and others should also should be concerned about the aspect of human development. Now, one of the very striking points that comes to Khalid's presentation is that whichever development indicator you take monthly per capita consumption expenditure, you take poverty, percentage of people lying below poverty line, then you take malnutrition indicators, you take access to education, educational attainment, and you discover that they are lagging far too behind. They are at the bottom of the, in fact, the various social group. He has shown that for all these indicators, the lowest value is, or highest value, depending on the nature of the indicators, is there for the tribal, followed by scheduled caste, then by Muslim, then by OBC, and then by high caste. So it's a hierarchy of development in which the scheduled tribe come at the bottom. Now, this should raise the issue, very important issue, as to why the tribal remain at level where they are at the moment. Khalid has also, Dr. Khalid has also shared with you the ownership of capital asset, ownership of land, and ownership of industry. The riddle and the contradiction that I have been always struggling is that the tribal do not lack as much in the ownership of capital asset. You might have seen from the figure that the percentage of self-employed farmer or landowner is higher among the scheduled tribe compared to scheduled caste. And they come very close to say OBC. And the percentage of casual wage laborer in rural area is also low, 27% compared to 33-35% for scheduled caste. On the self-employed in non-agriculture, that is business, they are not lagging too much behind. The difference is 2-3% between them and scheduled caste and others. Now, the issue is, why is it that for the scheduled caste, we ask that they are landless, so they should be given land. Here is a scheduled tribe community, Adivasi community, which have land, but at the same time, they are most poor. The poverty level is the highest, 41%, compared to scheduled caste and all India average. And of course, it is much higher compared to the OBC and high caste. How come that they have land ownership, which is appreciable, the reasonable, and yet they are most poor? Yeah, I think Khalid had earlier also looked into the poverty of the farmers. And even the poverty of the farmer is also highest among the scheduled tribe compared to scheduled caste and the OBC. Now, and a very high proportion of them are in rural area. So the as far as the development issue is concerned and policy is concerned, those who are working on tribal issues should address this issue. Why is it that despite ownership of land, they remain very poor? Now, I have been writing on that their productivity is low, acceptance of new technology like fertilizer, seed, or their land quality is not as good, but nevertheless they can have a tree cultivation, flower cultivation, fruit cultivation on a modern line. My hypothesis is that the tribal have not been given an advantage of science and technology, partly because nobody has given the attention that tree cultivation, flower cultivation, fruit cultivation, and other cultivation can be developed on scientific. Partly because there are anthropologists who want to protect their agriculture, who protect under the garb of protecting their culture, they do not allow them to get the advantage of science and technology. So I think this is an issue which people like Jagannath and Khaka and others should also address, beside the issue of identity, whether they should be named as indigenous or they should be named as Adivasi or tribal. That is equally important. I don't have a problem with that. But the issue of development, immense poverty, immense malnutrition, immense starvation. So that issue should also be addressed. I think this is linked with the issue which Jagannath has rightly pointed out, that what is matter is not development model, development. What is important is the type of development model. That you want to develop mines, you want to develop coal and others. You develop in a manner such that the tribal benefit out of it. Tribal are not displaced. Why should they be displaced? If you give them guarantee, okay, their land will be taken away. But if you give them the guarantee that they will be given the job, they will be given the housing, there will be school which will be constructed around the area, mining area, then they will benefit. So it's a question of the type of development model, which is also important, which is not taken into care. I do recall, when I was the chairman of the University Grant Commission, I may happen to meet the Kasturi Ranjan, who was a member of Planning Commission at that time. And I told him that I am going to Mongolia. So he immediately asked me, Professor Thorat, in Mongolia, they have developed a community-based model of exploring the minerals. And so the people in the area where the minerals are there, they develop the model of mineral extraction in a manner such that the community benefits. So I went there and I had to look around, but I could not get the material. But whatever material that I got and I passed it on to him, I think if I remember correctly, is that the entire community, which is going to lose the land because they have a housing there, they are involved in management of excavation of minerals. They are involved in taking out the minerals. They are given job. Then there is housing created for them. Then there are schools. There are civic communities. So it is an inclusive model. It is not a model which displaces them or exclude them. That is not done in India. So I think Jagannath has a point that for as far as the Adivasis are concerned, you have to talk about type of model. you are having a irrigation development and you are completely displacing them. Can you have a irrigation development in manner such that it doesn't make a anti-development, but at the same time, it doesn't make become an anti-Adivasi? You develop the model in a manner such that they are all involved. I remember, I wrote a book on Dr. Ambedkar and water and power policy. Dr. Ambedkar was a labor minister in 1942-44, and irrigation was with him. And the first irrigation project he developed was Damodar Valley project, one of the biggest projects. We have not heard of any displacement issue and issue in Damodar, because Dr. Ambedkar saw to it that the people are dealt in that area in a manner such that they became a part of the development of the irrigation. They get first claim on the irrigation water, they get water supply, they have schools, they have health facility and all that. So I think my suggestion to some of those who are working on tribal should focus more, equally more, on the developmental issue. This is not an, I'm not making an argument that the identity issue be neglected. That should be carried forward, no harm. But we should focus on the development, because the tribals are the most poor, wretchedly poor, and all indicators of human development they lag behind. So it should stuck in your mind that why is it that we have so much of funding, there is a separate ministry, there is a tribal sub-plan, there are several schemes, and yet they remain poor. It means there is something wrong is going on there. Sweepage of funds, leakage of fund, and development model. So I think these are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share with you, because merely telling their story is not enough, but we will have to identify critical problem and suggest certain solutions. Thank you, Vinod, for inviting me and asking me to chair this session. Very, very useful session.
Yes, sir.
Thanks also Khaka and Gautam Gauli and other senior professor who also joined in this particular seminar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So we'll also thank Dr. Khalid Khan and Dr. Jagannath for making the wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And also thanks to all the participants for listening this webinar. Thank you all. Have a good day.